Hey there. Today we are going to make a really vibrant and exciting tasting cilantro beef bowl. It's going to have big, bold flavors, wonderfully tender beef, and lots of umami. Now, if you are like me and you live in North America or you live in Europe, chances are you have a electric stovetop. And the problem with electric stovetops and beef stir-fries is that they don't get hot enough. And what happens is your beef starts bleeding all of its wonderful juices out, gets really dry and tough. It's a mess. We're going to show you how to get really tender beef stir-fries without the need of a hot live fire stovetop. So I think this is going to be really helpful for you. Let's get started. Okay, clean cutting board. We're going to start prepping the material used for garnish and the materials that we're going to eat raw first. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a red onion and just slice it. If you really enjoy the flavor and the crunch of the onions that are local to your area or part of world, you can cut it in thicker slices. For me, this onion that I bought in the supermarket, given that it is late fall in Ontario, was pretty underwhelming. It just had very little sweetness and a lot of spice, so I'm going to cut it finely. Now, this will go to the bottom of a heat-resistant casserole pan or large glass bowl because we are going to be pouring hot oil over this dish at the end. Now, if this seems like a recurring theme in my videos, it's one of the best methods to create aromatics without the need of a really hot stovetop. Next is going to be a lot of cilantro. Wash this thoroughly, you're going to be eating it raw. If you really hate cilantro, this isn't the right dish for you. What you can use in replacement, if you really like the idea of this dish, is a lot of really fresh chives and green onion in combination. It will taste nothing like this, and it will not taste nearly as good, in my opinion, but it's a possible alternative. Okay, next up we are going to cut up some chilies and garlic. Just slice up your chilies in little rings and get rid of the seeds if you don't want too much sort of slow burn heat, and finally chop your garlic. It doesn't have to be a neat job. Use whatever method to get the job done. Put these ingredients in their own little bowl and we're going to use them later. Okay, moving on to my piece of beef. You don't need to buy a piece of steak for this. If the meat is good enough for steak, don't waste it on a dish like this. What you want to buy is a nice and relatively lean-ish piece of meat that is really made for roasting. What I have here, I don't really know what it is, but if you try to make a steak with this would be too tough, which is a good thing. Cheap cuts like this, when sliced right and treated right, can be just as tender and super cheap. What you're going to want to do with this beef first is to separate it sort of along the natural seams of silver skin and fat within the muscles. Once you remove most of the silver skin and fat, we're going to set those aside. They can be used for stocks and other purposes later, but we don't need them for this particular dish. Now, when you're cooking this dish, the proportions of everything I add is really meant for around 1 to 1.5 pounds of beef if you're pushing it a little bit. Now, I use more than 2 pounds of beef, 2 and something. I don't know the exact amount, but that's actually a big problem. Inadvertently, what I've created for myself is I have so much beef that even if I put them in the wok in 2 separate portions, I still have a situation where there is no way for my electric stovetop to get hot enough to make the beef not bleed. And let's just call this a happy accident and pretend that I'm showing you what happens if you have a really terrible electric cooktop. But don't make the mistake that I did. When you are cutting up the beef, you want to find the direction of the beef's grain and cut in, I guess, thin-ish slices, sort of against the natural grain of the beef. What this will do is that because you're making these thin slices, severing the muscle fibers of the beef, you make the beef really easy to chew. This also creates the issue where because all of the muscle fibers are severed, it is really easy to make the beef bleed and lose all of its moisture. So the next step that we're going to do is going to help address the bleeding beef. Okay, so because we have a not so great cut of beef, and skip this step, please, if you have like a good piece of steak, we're going to want to wash the beef with a little bit of baking soda. What this will do is it will sort of break up the tough sinews and muscle fibers and pull the muscle fibers apart. This effectively tenderizes the beef and loosens it a little bit so we can beat more water into it. You're going to need a couple of tablespoons of baking soda and around a liter-ish of water, and just give the beef a nice rub. Once you see the water sort of change color and a lot of the blood come out, and you've been rubbing it for about 30 seconds, rinse it repeatedly in water to get rid of all of the baking soda. Make sure you rinse enough times, because all of that baking soda staying around in your beef is going to make it taste very bitter. Make sure you rinse out the baking soda. Okay, now you see the beef, sort of the fibers pull apart. It'll marinate really well. You want to go in with a little bit of a dark Chinese vinegar and a splash of rice cooking wine and a liberal sprinkling of salt. Now, I didn't use enough salt here, oddly enough, because I have so much beef. The proportions that I show you is still really for a 1 pound or 1.5 pound of beef kind of recipe. And then we're going to go in with just some scraps of the onions and ginger. If I had some green onion or Chinese leek onions laying around in the house, I'd probably throw some of those in as well. Now, notice that after adding salt and mixing the beef a little bit, the puddle of sort of bloody juices that was bleeding out from the beef is reabsorbed. For some reason, I don't know exactly why, but you'll see this in a lot of preparation for Chinese stir fries. After washing the beef a little bit with maybe just water and a little bit of baking soda, adding salt will actually help the beef sort of reabsorb some of the liquids that are lost. And look at how plump that slice of beef is. That is how you get tender stir fry. Okay, it's been sitting around for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe. What we're going to do now is, after picking out or attempt to pick out the sort of scraps that you used for the marinade, we're going to add just a large heaped spoon. I think my spoon is a little bit larger than a tablespoon. A large scoop of cornstarch or potato starch or mung bean starch to sort of create this slimy slurry that will coat the outside of your beef slice. What that will do is that when this meets hot oil, when we're stir frying, the outer shell will cook first and help seal in the juice instead of having your beef sort of just bleed all of the juice out immediately. This will buy us some more time on a slower cooktop that we have at home. When you do this, just make sure you don't use tapioca starch. I have seen people attempt to follow recipes like this and all they had was tapioca starch. That will create a sticky mess. That will not do the job. You should use either cornstarch, sweet potato starch, or mung bean starch. And if you're stretching it, some wheat starch will do. But do not use tapioca starch. Thank you very much. We're going to add a little bit of peanut oil. The reason why we're adding a little bit of oil, you can use any oil that you have as long as they're fairly neutral, so nothing like olive oil. You can use any oil. What this will do is by mixing in oil into the starch, it will prevent clumping and things sticking together when we later stir fry the beef. Now, our beef is coated with starch, and if you've ever cooked anything that's sort of been covered with starch in a non-stick pan, you'll know that that can be a nightmare. To prevent that, we're going to I wouldn't call this seasoning the wok, but we are going to slick the wok with oil several times. What you want to do is have sort of a large cylinder can pot of oil, cold oil, nearby. You're going to get your wok piping hot, go into it with oil, sort of have that go all the way around your wok. And what you'll see is that it'll get your wok nice and shiny. And once that oil becomes hot, dump it back out into the container of cold oil. We can reuse that later for cooking. We don't need to dump that out and throw it away. But we're going to slick our pan 2-3 times before we go in with our beef. Now, after you go in with your beef, you want to cook the beef for just long enough where the outside has changed color and it doesn't look sort of red pinkish. At that point, your beef is cooked. Get it out of your wok as quickly as possible. Go into your beef first with a nice sprinkling of salt again. Taste before you do this so you don't oversalt, and add a little bit of sugar to sort of balance out the later sort of more intense ingredients that we're going to add. Okay, to that you want a generous squirt, that is the proper verb, of oyster sauce. You want about 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce if you're using 1.5 pounds of beef. I didn't use enough here, so ignore the visual reference. And then we are going to add some chili flakes. A nice, generous pinch or two, depending on how hot you want this to be, is going to be enough. But if you're really feeling the heat, I've found success sort of with almost half a cup of dried chili flakes. That'll also work. Add your garlic and your red chilies and just a small portion of the cilantro you prepared earlier. And then we're going to go in with sizzling oil. Hot oil pours are always my favorite part of cooking. It fills the air with delicious smells. In terms of satisfaction, I'd rate that oil pour like a 6 out of 10 because I sort of poured lopsided. Anyway, let's first go in with a generous splash of vinegar. I would say that would be 3 or 4 tablespoons. If you have a weaker vinegar, go in with like 5 or 6. Add in the rest of your cilantro. On top of that cilantro, isolate it from the heat. A generous sprinkling of MSG, probably around just a teaspoon. And then the tip of a teaspoon of chicken powder. Okay, we then went in with just a little bit of dark soy. That is just for color. We don't want to use light soy because we can't get the color we want, and also it'll taste too much like soy sauce. This dish should not taste like soy sauce, so don't use light soy. You can serve this dish 2 ways. Just in the large casserole pan / glass bowl, you can garnish with some more cilantro and chili oil so it looks nice and appetizing. Or the alternative is you take both the juice and the beef onto freshly steamed rice, preferably for this dish, a rice produced in the northeast of China, 东北大米. It's really good and magical with a beef dish like this. This dish can be served hot or cold, but if you're going to serve it cold, you want to use more oyster sauce than I used, more MSG than I used, a little bit less salt and more vinegar. That will create sort of a tangy and different experience. And I actually really like this dish served cold during summer as well. So there you have it. That's my cilantro beef bowl. It is wonderfully intense and aromatic. It's one of my favorite stir fries, and it's really easy to make in the sense that it's difficult to screw up this dish. I screwed up making this video. It still turned out delicious, so I thought I'd share it with you. Anyway, if you like videos like this, make sure you check out my channel. I upload a lot more content. And yeah, I hope you enjoy.